Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to bring you an important conversation for this moment about institutions evolving to be more student-centric. And when you think about the idea of student-centric, it seems logical that that would be a natural thing. And most institutions, if you ask them if they are student-centered, of course we are. But if you just take a look at their data, if you just take a look at the number of students who have walked out their doors, never to return because of a bureaucratic issue, because of lack of flexibility, because of poor communication, or really illogical strategy in terms of how we support students, then you would know that that's actually not a reality for most institutions. It's actually quite difficult. So today we're going to talk to you about what we're learning and what folks have experienced over the past few months in particular around doing this work. But I think it's important to set the context for the conversation so that we understand that it's, as much as people think that this should be natural in higher education, the truth is that higher education was never designed around students. In fact, if you look back to original forms of universities, we were actually designed around the faculty initially. And over time, and that was because the faculty represented our intellectual capital. It represented really our value that we could contribute. But over time, it seems that institutions have evolved to focus on efficiency and accountability and what would be most convenient for the administration. And rarely has it given people the time that they need to think about what would it be like to experience this as a student and an empathy first perspective. And I know this personally because I mean, it's my lived experience, and probably for many of you as well. As a kid who grew up in poverty in rural Montana, when I first got to college, I naturally thought, with Pell Grant in hand, that the institution, knowing my background, that naturally they would make sure that I knew the secret language, that I knew how to navigate, and they would reassure and make sure that I stayed on the right course. And, when I finally graduated 7 years later, I had 50 extra credits that I didn't need and nearly $50,000 in student loans. And my story is the best case scenario for most students. The reality is that our institutions are often a bit more like the Hunger Games than we like to admit. And it's not because anyone's planning it that way. It's actually because nobody really has the time and the luxury of thinking things through. We're often trying to kind of do everything to serve everyone, to make everything happen. And that hustle has worked. But in the end, we know that if you look at the millions of students who have some college and no degree, it's clearly something we need to address. And in particular, right now. Because in COVID, we've seen our institutions adapt very quickly. We've also seen hunger and homelessness rise. We've also seen just tremendous heart-wrenching stories. And we need to make sure that our institutions are positioned to anticipate and to meet the needs of our students. And I don't know about you, but in this moment, I've never had more confidence in higher education than I do right now. Because what I'm observing is that the resilience of our students is on full display. The care and compassion and empathy of our faculty, staff, and administrators is on full display. And the true leadership that is being tested in a way that we haven't seen of our presidents and chancellors is on full display. And I think that right now we were able to accomplish and innovate and change in ways that we never thought was possible in higher ed in the past few months. And so this is our moment for us to rethink everything we do as much as possible around the students who we always should have been serving. When we talk about adult learners, student parents, low-income communities, first-generation communities, whether it's DACA students, students of color, we're talking about rural students, we need to be thinking about the needs of our students from those who we frankly didn't put at the center enough in the past. This is our one moment in time. And so we're going to have a conversation that is going to draw upon the experience of three distinguished experts in the field. First, I'm really delighted to introduce you to Marcia Ballinger, who's the president of Lorain County Community College. And many of you have heard about the incredible success story at Lorain, but also Nancy Cantor, the chancellor of Rutgers University, New York, who, if you had a chance to watch the documentary Unlikely, it profiled the tremendous courage that she's demonstrated throughout her career fighting for students and really advancing this narrative. And lastly, I'm excited to introduce you one of my new friends, Dr. Gay Teresa Johnson from UCLA, who's an associate professor in Chicana Studies and African American Studies. And we're going to have a quick conversation about this, but then afterward, you're going to hear from Dr. Timothy Rennick from Georgia State University, who's going to talk to you a bit more about the how. So first, I would love for each of the panelists to introduce kind of your perspective in this conversation by sharing something that has needed to change for your institution in COVID, or one element of your institution that you've seen that really, when we're talking about student-centric, how can you give us a real tangible example of your perspective? And Marcia, would you mind kicking us off?
Such a pleasure to join you today in the panel and to talk about what does it mean to truly be a student-centered institution. At Lorain County Community College in Ohio, we have really, for the past 10 years, have been on a student success journey where we have been intentionally designing with student success in mind. And so throughout that transformation and all of the strategies, and as you said, Tim is going to share quite a bit of those. We were in a position when we had to, in March, move everything totally online and remote when our governor shut the state down. And in that moment, we realized that we had a wonderful launch pad to build from in terms of the holistic student supports that are very intensive that we had employed in addition to already having our Associate of Arts and Associate of Science degrees online. But the pivot during COVID, what I would say one of the most important was to survey all of our students to find out specifically what did they need from us to ensure their success. So whether that was food or technology, and the commitment that we publicly made to our students was that no student would go without food or technology. And so we had just this past year, timing is everything, we had created an advocacy resource center that knits together everything from emergency aid to mental health services to our food pantry, taking a page out of the playbook of Amarillo College and all the wonderful work that Sarah Goldrick-Rab does. And so those services we were able to maintain. We continue to do those, and that commitment will carry through because we know that many adult students from our community have barriers, and we had to bust through the barriers and do that in a much more proactive way and to be even more intentional about it.
Thank you, Marcia. That's helpful. Chancellor Cantor, Nancy, would you mind sharing us your perspective from Rutgers University Newark about what student-centered is needing to look like for you in this moment as you've had to adapt?
Absolutely, and I want to say ditto to everything Marcia has said because there's going to be a lot of overlap here. So Rutgers University Newark is located in Newark, the largest city, Black and brown city in the state of New Jersey, and one of the most interesting things has been how we build on the experiences of our actual students, as opposed to just thinking about students having to assimilate to us. So one of the things of a student-centered institution, and I think COVID has really brought it out, is that we have to think about both what the assets are that our students bring to the table and how COVID has created disparities in their home communities. Many of our, if not most of our students are commuters. They are affected as much by what we do at the institution as by what's happening in their community. So how do you bring that together? Marcia mentioned technology. At least 30% of Newarkers, and we have students from all over New Jersey and beyond, but have no digital access. So they are behind the digital divide. They need not only technology, but Wi-Fi connections. And then the state of New Jersey, of course, was one of the hot spots. And so we closed down libraries. We had students sitting in parking lots trying to do remote courses and doing their exams on their phones. But what we had to really understand was how to ramp up the asset framework, as opposed to saying that's a deficit and putting a stigma around the ways in which students weren't prepared and faculty weren't prepared. Our faculty commute, they commute using public transportation largely, so they were affected. So going remote meant that we had to dig down to who our students were, what their communities were, things like eviction notices, losses of jobs, food insecurity. Our food pantry had to keep going. We couldn't turn our back on that. So when you think about remote, many institutions say remote or not, as if it's a distancing of the self of the institution from the student and their community. For us, it meant a doubling down on their community and on the student.
Thank you for that. Dr. Teresa Johnson, could you share with us, you obviously have a depth of understanding of the field of wisdom in terms of what we actually know about students, what we know about the communities that we're not serving. I'm just curious if you could share with us your unique perspective from that that's grounded in theory of what you see us not doing in terms of student centrism that's prevalent and we really need to focus on in the midst of COVID. Are there any particular examples beyond the ones that they've just mentioned around technology or of just in general what we're seeing with especially the food insecure students that for you really feels like this is something that we need to think about?
Well, as someone who's jointly appointed in Chicano Central American Studies and African American Studies, I was exposed to a lot of the things that you all are talking about firsthand, because a lot of our students maintain a very high touch level of communication with us all of the time, not just when they're in crisis, but in order to navigate what it means to be in an institution like UCLA as a first generation student, as a student visa holder, as an undocumented student, as someone who is house insecure, or who is just adjusting to what it means to be at an elite institution when they come from a community that doesn't traditionally have that kind of access, not just to the institution itself, but also the incredible cultural divide that it constantly gives the message that folks don't deserve to be there. And so I really want to just say here that even beyond the kinds of institutional the kind of institutional integrity that a lot of colleges and universities stepped up to deliver, front line of folks who were engaging students right away were business officers, counselors, undergraduate advisors, postdoctoral students, TAs, all of the people that don't get sort of sung about when we talk about how institutions respond. These are folks who are saying, oh, this person is hungry. I mean, it's like it's such a sort of what seems like a very simple observation and acknowledgement, but beyond even referring to the kinds of resources that had to be shored up by institutions, but to say there is an immediate need, like in the next 2 hours, that needs to be met here. How do we activate the communities that we've worked so hard to maintain under the conditions of being in what are traditionally exclusive institutions? And to see that happen was incredible, because of course there was a lag time. It was very difficult for not just teachers to get online and begin to teach, but for students to move out of dorms, for students to move home with other siblings and siblings' children and into one room studios or one bedroom apartments with parents who work and are essential workers. There was that, but there was, and there was a struggle for institutions to also adapt. But there was also the immediate kind of shock that students had that they needed to process in real time. And so especially then with the added injury of the way that our administration has taken the opportunity to then find ways extrajudicially or personally make people feel bad about what they didn't have. So, you know, the scares that people intentionally put on, knowing that they were not constitutional, that they would not probably be able to get the to exclude students that were visa holders, but the fact, the energy, the resources that institutions had to use in order to challenge that in court, but especially the fear that gave to all of these students, the students that didn't receive any stimulus checks, the ones who were married to undocumented people, the ones who are undocumented who are being threatened with not being able to come back to school, and the ways in which institutions are trying to get around that by saying, can we do some kind of in-person thing just in case? It's an incredible amount of energy spent on top of what we were already doing. So my students are the ones who are dealing with this, or if they're not personally dealing with it, are trying to help friends. I had several students who left the dorms and didn't have anywhere to go, and then eventually were able to come back once the institution, as quickly as possible, got together the protocols for emergency housing. But it was a very, very difficult time for everyone, but for very specific populations as well. This became something that not only was a hardship, but also revealed the spirit and the culture of understanding that we worked so hard to cultivate, both because of and in spite of the institutions that we're a part of.
Thank you for that. That really, I think that underscores some of what we heard earlier. And I want to drive further into this, that in this moment, we have a really high amount of fear and scarcity. And fear and scarcity do certain things. They help us retract. We're less likely to communicate. We're less likely to probably push at times. And so I'm wondering, you know, I'm hearing that theme, and then I'm also hearing about this need for universities to listen better, to find new ways to listen, especially in this remote context. So President Ballinger or Chancellor Cantor, I'm wondering if either of you could share how you're thinking about the way your institution integrates the lived experience of students and how you're able to listen with this broader context of fear and scarcity. Like, how are there things that universities can do if they're going to be student-centric that help overcome that fear and scarcity?
Well, let me just start briefly, and Marcia jump in. I think the most important thing from my perspective is, again, to locate our students as in an asset framework within their communities, and to draw into our curriculum, into our programming, into our engagement with our own, as anchor institutions in our own communities, draw on their lived experience. Let me give you just a quick example in the COVID context. Most of our students, many of our students are multilingual. They've often grown up in homes where English is not the first language. When Newark as a hotspot needed contact tracers, our Lives in Translation program got together hundreds of our students who speak many languages, who could then become contact tracers in the COVID epidemic, so that families in Newark and throughout New Jersey would not feel put off when somebody called and spoke English as opposed to speaking Portuguese or Creole or Spanish. It's incredibly important that we do that on a regular basis, that we draw on the actual lived experiences as an asset that can be contributed to the curriculum, contributed to the projects. We have a huge multimedia arts organization called Express Newark at Rutgers Newark, where we are doing stories of the newest Americans, which is our huge immigrant population. What we're doing during COVID is that they are going around doing experiences of the pandemic, stories from the pandemic, from different subcultures and groups within the community. That gives voice and power and experience in terms of learning. So it's really centering on the experience and the community. as opposed to the traditional model, Bridget, that you talked about early on, which is really universities as monasteries. You come into us and you do what we are, as opposed to the kind of two-way street and a seamless connection between the university and the community and our students who come from there.
So I would just add to that, that as community colleges, which are, open access institutions that are founded and grounded in what the needs and aspirations of a local community are. Our students throughout COVID have just been extraordinary, because in many cases, they're the ones on the front lines for health and safety, as we're a major transfer institution, but at the same time, our career and technical programs are those that from nursing to law enforcement. In fact, just earlier today, I was recording for them their graduation messages, because we have our LPN students are graduating next week, as is our police academy. And throughout the COVID epidemic, while we had to shift our delivery of education and the support services, the reality is those students were continuing in alternative formats and out on the front lines in the community, both from law enforcement and health and safety. And so that's just one example, but I think that truly goes to the DNA of community colleges. And so while we are that unique, first entry into college, many of our students are adult learners. About 30% of our students are dually enrolled in high school and college. And so being able to support them as they either worked in the community, and many lost their jobs during this time. And so how we ramped up additional services and programs, short-term programs, to help get them to an industry recognized credential. So digging deep into the community, partnering with our partners, whether it's Jobs and Family Services or the workforce system, the schools, K-12, and our employers, have been even more significant and proactive, and will continue to do so as we reinvent who we are.
That's great. And you're all hearing at home that the institution, it's like the posture has to shift from playing, defense and just kind of catching when things go wrong, to actually playing offense and being anticipatory, to being more creative about how we listen. We can't just be trolling Reddit. That is just literally so old school, and it's not a strategic way for us to get insights into what our students are going through. But I also just get this sense that, especially with adult learners, we know that more people are unemployed than have been before. We know that there are a lot of people who need to reimagine a future career path, that their entire industry has been decimated, and they're going to need us to help them. But we can't help them if we're not listening better, if we're not actually pivoting who we think our ideal student is to encompassing the kinds of folks who are really the ones who we need to serve right now. So I want to pivot a little bit and shift to Dr. Teresa Johnson. I know that you have, again, that depth of expertise and wisdom to share with us, to give us perspective. I'm hoping you can give us a sense of what history can teach us about this moment. I know that you and I, in our prior conversation, you shared a little bit about how we could think about this, what's going on, and how we need to serve students differently. And I think I want to hear your insights.
Thank you. Well, I want to also just say that my co-panelists said some just amazing things, and they really inspire a lot of hope for me in the ways that the institutions see the needs of our students, but also the assets that students bring. And so your question, Bridget, is so helpful, because when I think about all that we're faced with, and I think about the ways that this moment has provoked a lot of kind of panic for a lot of us who were, just to be real, it was a very difficult transition, and it makes us feel sometimes that this is like unprecedented. And I want to just validate that and say that many of us feel like we've never experienced this kind of thing as educators, but also as a country. But many of us who study history, we know that that's not actually true, that we have experienced these kinds of hardships. And especially what Professor Cantor, you were saying about these art projects reminds me of something that I've been thinking a lot about lately. And this has been even more bolstered by the passing of John Lewis, but because John Lewis was so pivotal in the organizing of Freedom Summer. And when we think about Freedom Summer and the Freedom Schools in Mississippi, we are so fortunate to have precedent for how it is that we deal with educating in perilous times. And the Freedom Schools are such an amazing example because they were created to address something very specific, which was racial terror, which we are experiencing now, racial violence. We are also experiencing a really new and heightened awareness of racial violence by everyone. We have an incredible network of accomplices and people who wish to be part of this movement, and yet who also recognize the dangers for people of color, in particular for trans folks. And so when we look to Freedom Summer, it gives us inspiration to see not only how to deal with this, but the fact that we can overcome it. We can adapt. We have, I mean, it's an incredibly high level of adaptability that we have to have. But imagine what they were going through as they were planning Freedom Summer in 1963 and as they executed it in 1964. The kind of racial violence that was happening, we're not just talking about threats, we're talking about deaths, murders of people who were just trying to register folks to vote. That's it. Something that had been a right for nearly 100 years. And yet you could not vote in Mississippi without fearing for your life. And you couldn't even try to help to register people to vote. Swerner, Goodman, and Cheney going into Mississippi and being lynched as two of them white voter registration volunteers. And the idea behind the Freedom Schools was to get people to have a greater awareness of the connection of education to greater civic responsibility and involvement. And that's where we're at again. And yet we have so many more resources to draw from than John Lewis and his cohort had in 1964. And they asked some really, really important questions that I think we need to ask as well. They had sets of basic questions that were part of their curriculum, but they also had these core questions around what does the majority culture have that we want? And we have to ask ourselves that question, like kind of about like, what is it for those of us who are educating in this time that's very perilous and who are engaging with students who have little access to the things that they need the most right now? What is it that we want? What does the majority culture have that we don't want? And that kind of comes back to what both my co-panelists were saying, was like this asset mindset. What do we already have that we want to keep? That was the last question of the basic questions. And it's really important for us to think about the effects, the reverberating effects of student-centered curriculum, which is what Freedom Summer did. They focused on the lived experiences of people in Mississippi. They had people who ranged in age from 5 to 80. They had nearly 3,000 students, which is a testament to how much people want to be educated. Just like you all were saying, people switch to their phones to take tests. I describe this all the time. People back against the fridge because there's nowhere else to learn from. Microphone off, camera off, because there's children running around that aren't theirs, but nonetheless, they don't have the environment to learn from. But people want to learn and we want to teach. So we have what feels like an unprecedented time. But we also have all of the solutions that we need because we've already done this before. Many of our communities, especially Black and Brown communities, but also communities of multiracial organizers who have spent the time, who have done the work, who have done the thinking. And all we need to do is look to that history to find not just the solutions, but also the inspiration and the hope and the will to go on and to do something beautiful. And look what came out of it. an incredible, incredible organized effort for collective uplift. And that's what we need. I just lastly want to say that a lot of people may say, well, how is that relevant to me? I'm an accounting professor, for example. I'm not interested in organizing my students for collective action and civic engagement, but that is the mission of the institution. If we are educating institutions, that is our mission and that is our duty to the greater society, is that we think and research in order to put our resources to the good of our communities. That's what we're supposed to do. So even if it's not an explicit political message, it's still a kind of felt meaning of context and hope for the future.
Thank you for that. I so appreciate that context, and I just want to draw upon that as we really think about, in the midst of the widespread recognition of just racism, entrenched racism in this country, in the midst of COVID. I'm curious about both President Ballinger and Chancellor Cantor, how you are thinking about, how do institutions become student-centric when there are a portion of your students who are worried about being murdered on their way to classes by police on a regular basis, and they're experiencing this additional injustice? How can institutions shift what they do and be student-centric when there are students who are experiencing something so extreme? Is there a way that you're looking at how your institution better serves Black students or integrates their lived experience in this moment that we can start thinking more about?
I'll just start and share with you that we have a laser focus on equity and have been very deliberate in terms of creating and enhancing, I should say, the culture of care throughout the campus and partnering with the community. We have been very concerned, and Bridget, going back to your opening comments with regard to completion and with regard to having the right environment for students, because we want to ensure their success. And so our work has been very, very deliberate from multiple perspectives, but one of the greatest for us has been to increase educational attainment so that we can be that much more proactive with meaningful careers in our community. But we have a very strong leadership with our Equity for Students team on our campus. Part of that is all of the professional development being that common ground for our community, for the important, meaningful conversations to happen here. And again, to partner back with those in the community. It has certainly been, a time for us to lean in hard to our core mission and who we serve, and ensuring that the voices not only are heard and that we're listening, but that we are taking action. And so that is front and center for us, as it is throughout community colleges and all of higher education. And I think a different aspect for community colleges, because we are partnered in a very, very strategic and deliberate way with our entire community, from faith-based community to social service agencies to others, that we believe we're all in this together and are working and planning together to ensure that we strengthen our community and create that safety and take away that fear.
Yeah, and I want to build directly on what Marcia just said in terms of the seamless integration with community. So Rutgers University Newark is a very substantial anchor institution in Newark. We work with our mayor, Raz Baraka, a phenomenal mayor, with our Newark community street teams, with law enforcement, with every community-based organization, and our students get directly involved in that. First of all, many of our students are from the community, and secondly, many of our students have been impacted, for example, by mass incarceration, by juvenile justice kinds of issues, and the disparities that are there. We run a very substantial prison education program, both in the prisons and then a re-entry program for college degrees, both with our community college partners and at Rutgers Newark ourselves. And what we find is that the way in which we empower our students who are highly diverse to feel powerful in the current racial reckoning moment is by directly involving them on the line in the programs that make a difference in their community. And Newark is a centerpiece of what it means to have cross-sector collaboration. This isn't just our university, it's everything from the big Prudential Financial Corporation to City Hall to the community-based organizations that have been on the ground since the Newark Rebellion in 1967. So when our students feel that that is part of what it means to be powerfully educated in the 21st century, to be change agents, then we are saying to them, you have the world to remake in your stead. And I want to go back to what Dr. Johnson said, which was so powerful about the freedom schools. We run a freedom school in one of the public schools in Newark, and using the whole freedom school model. And it is so empowering, precisely because it was that cross-sector connection between those lived experiences and universities and educators, K-12 educators, not as experts, but as co-equal partners in the cultivation of talent and the creation of these change makers.
Thank you for that. So, well, I so appreciate what our panelists have brought to the table today. I think I heard quite a bit in terms of how institutions can overcome some of the fear and the uncertainty of this moment, the urgency for us to listen more deeply, and to draw upon history, because this is not our first time dealing with really serious challenges. Make sure that we're actually integrating those lessons. But I also, Dr. Johnson, you and I, when we were talking to prepare for this, we talked about how just there's so much resilience on full display right now, and that our students in particular, we have so much to be inspired by. And I feel like your remarks in particular really kind of underscore the broader theme that we all need to lean into in this moment around, we have to do the work of redesigning our institutions. It always needed to happen. Let's take advantage of this moment, because change is pretty much the norm these days, and there is no normal anymore. So in that moment, we should leverage what we know. We should listen more deeply to our students. And I also think that we need to think differently about how we use data. And so I'm going to shift now to introducing our last speaker, which is going to be Dr. Timothy Rennick from Georgia State University, who is widely known as kind of the national expert on student success, an institution that has eliminated race and income as a predictor of outcome, and is the #1 producer of African-American bachelor's degrees at a not-for-profit institution in this country. So it's perfectly well-timed for us to hear from Dr. Rennick and hear from him specifically about why we need to double down on data in COVID and also in the midst of everything else that's happening. So Tim, thank you so much for joining me. But I also want to just acknowledge and thank President Ballinger, Chancellor Cantor, and Dr. Teresa Johnson. Thank you so much for pouring into this community and giving us your wisdom and your insight. And we're so excited to hear how Tim is going to take us to the next level in terms of exactly how we go from here.
Thank you.
Thank you.